Chair, we are now live.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Sam. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well in the last week before half term. I hope everyone is in good health. So we've got a fairly short agenda today in terms of items for...
Chair, we are now live.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Sam. Oh, sorry, I think there was a bit of a repeat there in the background, but that's fine. It's all the teething issues, no problem. Okay, so just as a reminder, please can you keep your microphones muted? We won't use the chat because this is streamed live, so people who are using the streaming service to view won't be able to see the chat. So if you could raise your hands, as we have done previously, myself and Simon will keep an eye out and make sure that everybody is able to contribute. And then we've got two main items for the agenda, and for each one we'll pause at the end just to see if there's any questions, comments, and take us through each of those items. Okay. Right, so I'll take us through the main elements in relation to forum standing business. So, Sam, I think we've got a few apologies.
Yes, Chair, we've had apologies from Cameron Shaw, Emma Richards, Mick O'Neill Duff, Rebecca Watkin. Are there any other apologies that anyone has been received? No? Okay, I can confirm we are quorate.
Thank you very much. And do we have any, we haven't got any new members, have we, at this meeting?
We've got no confirmation of any new members or resignations. We do retain some vacancies, 2 secondary governor vacancies, a nursery governor vacancy, and a non-school member governor from Clifton of Diocese. These are all ongoing, and work is going on behind the scenes to fill these vacancies.
Lovely, thank you. I know the governor one is one that we've been carrying for a while, so any thoughts around how we can promote that or engage governors in that, that would be really helpful, please. Thank you very much. Okay.
Declaration of interest. Has anyone got any declarations of interest, please? No, thank you very much.
Oh, great, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm just going to take us then through the meeting, the last meeting in terms of minutes. Is there any, rather than stepping through page by page, is there any points that anyone wanted to raise around the accuracy of the minutes? Any other points? No. Okay, so we do have a number of actions in the meetings. Just bear with me. So there's an action in relation to the risk protection arrangement and the insurance. That we will provide a breakdown of what's made up and included in that assurance at the next meeting, or for members that were specifically concerned about this, so the maintained schools. Now that's an action next to ALIB. Is that Angel? Is that you?
I'll admit, yeah, AL is myself. Thank you, Chair. Unfortunately, Paul from insurance couldn't be here today, and he did ask, the detailed breakdowns, can be shared in the next meeting, if that's all right.
I think it was particularly Chris. Is that what do you need, Chris? Because that was one.
Well, the thing being is that obviously that breakdown of that, shall we say, the difference between the RPA and what was the insurances come out of delegated services is quite a considerable amount of money. And I'm working on the assumption that we haven't done previously had a meeting in July. Therefore, that's going to be near enough 6 months into local maintained schools budgets, and we won't know what's happening with that amount of money. So I am concerned it hasn't come tonight.
So Chris, I am going to talk about the July meeting. I do think we need to go ahead with that one, actually. So, but that's not to delay the piece of work that we're talking about. So Angel, can we commit to having that circulated to maintain school in the next couple of weeks? Or Denise, did you want to come in there?
Yes, I did, and apologies, I wasn't at the last meeting, so I wasn't aware of the discussion that took place, but I did take away the action from the previous meeting to ensure that we didn't enter into a contractual arrangement that didn't deliver value for money. We did go out to tender, and Paul may have mentioned when he presented at the last meeting that we're now facing a very hard insurance market. Hence, when the tender responses came back, including those for schools, it was a more cost-effective approach to be able to basically utilise the arrangements being provided by the RPA, and also dovetailing that with an element of insurance from to bridge the gap. So Paul can provide the analysis, but I can assure you that all of our insurance costs are reflecting significant challenges in the insurance market. And what we've selected is the option that provides the most cost-effective approach. If we'd actually incorporated you into the contract, you'd be paying even more than what's being proposed now. And that was the basis on the decision. But I can ask Paul to just give a quick analysis and overview. And I think we'll also just share with you something from our brokers in terms of the current insurance market and the fact that it is a hard market and all insurances are being challenged at this stage. So we'll provide that to you in writing, hopefully, and then circulate that to you for some consideration. But we have now let the contracts, but we let the contracts on the basis that it was more cost effective for schools to not be included in the local authority arrangements. So that's the approach, but we can summarise that for you if that would help, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, Denise, yeah, fully appreciate that, you know, we've gone to RPA, which works out around about £10 per pupil cheaper than the £31. So it's what's happened to that £170,000 that will be saved between the £31 that we're paying through dedelegated and the RPA amount.
So I think that action will be an action that sits with our finance colleagues as well, rather than Paul from an insurance perspective. So we can do that. So I can work with Angel and Travis to then work through the accounting treatments and then what does or doesn't come back, or what sits in the pool, etc. as well, because Paul is focused on the insurance element. But we'll go through with colleagues and then present something back so that we're clear on the accounting treatment and whether or not there's anything being reduced, returned or retained in the pool.
Okay, if that can be done for the July meeting, although obviously schools aren't going to get that rebate by the end of the first quarter return, then are they? If there is going to be a rebate.
Is that what you were hoping to have, or would you pool that? So let's present the information back. We'll send it to you virtually, and then if we want to then take a slightly different approach, then we can bring it back. So we'll take comments when we circulate it, and then decide whether we need to bring it back for a July meeting if the approach isn't what you're supportive of.
Thank you, Denise. I think that's a really helpful solution because I don't think it necessarily needs to come back to the forum if the concern is resolved in terms of where that additional contribution has gone. Okay, thank you. Then there's a couple of items in relation to slides. So slides from Ian and also from Alison should have been circulated to members.
Yeah, they were done. They were also uploaded onto the schools forum site, so available to public as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, that takes us then through the matters arising and the actions. Next item on the agenda is matters arising not already covered on the agenda. So I have been notified about two that I wanted to bring to the forum. The first one is in relation to concerns from our primary schools in relation to capacity versus demand, falling roles and not being able to fill places. So I've asked Alison to provide a bit of an update in her section to provide a bit more information around what we're doing around supporting schools that are not within primaries. We have talked about this before at previous meetings. We obviously had the update from Ian last time in terms of what that capacity looks like. And I absolutely agree that it is a concern at the moment. So over to Alison on that one. And then the second one is from Sam in relation to, as you remember, there's two task and finish groups that we set up last year, I think it was. One was high needs and the other one is early years. So Sam has specifically mentioned that we've got a couple of vacancies now on the early years group. And we are planning to have one more meeting of both groups in June before we wrap up for the year. So it's a sort of request in terms of if you're able to join and contribute to the early years group, that would be really helpful. So that's a request to you all. If you're early years specialists or not, I think some contribution towards that group would be really helpful. And also Sam's mentioned that we're going to look at the terms of reference for the two groups, just to make sure that they are still fit for purpose, but if they might move more to subgroups of the forum, but they still hold a really important role in terms of analysing those things in a bit more depth to be able to feed into the transformation programme and other items. Okay. Right, so I'll move us on then to item 4. So over to you, Alison, in terms of an update, please.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. So what I wanted to do in tonight's session was to really build on the previous sufficiency discussion, and Sarah's obviously alluded to part of that discussion being part of the primary challenges as well, and just really give you some further updates in terms of primary, secondary and specialists. So in relation to secondary sufficiency and provision, and there has actually been some good news since we last came together as a forum, and that's the fact that the planning consent has been granted for both the Silverthorne Lane site in East Central and the Daventry Road site in South Bristol. And as you know, particularly with the Silverthorne Lane site, that has been overdue for some time. So the two new schools, the first one is Oasis Temple Quarter, Oasis Academy, sorry, Temple Quarter, and that's going to be the East Central provision, and it's forecast to open in a permanent building for 2025 at the moment. And obviously, given the significant pressures on secondary places, particularly in this area of Bristol, we're working with the DfE and with the Oasis Trust towards opening in temporary accommodation for 2023. So there's some feasibility work happening at the moment, and that's underway on a site in Spring Street in BS3. If all goes well, they could start taking students from next September, which obviously would take significant pressure out of the system. And then for the Oasis Academy on Daventry Road, this is obviously the site in the south of the city, and it'll be built on the former Merrywood school site, or the park, which is obviously relocated next door into the new build. So again, looking for the permanent build, that's actually due to be in permanent accommodation for 2024. And the caveat, obviously, to all of this is the current pressure on the construction industry. So, you know, certainly at the point of giving this information, that is the plan. There's also the plan for the South provision to open in temporary accommodation for September 2023. And they're currently working towards using part of the Oasis Academy at John Williams site in Hengrove to accommodate that. So again, feasibility work happening at the moment, making sure that that site would meet the needs of staff and students. But again, if all goes well, that would be looking to open in September 2023, which means by next year, obviously, as we hit that peak, that does provide a significant amount of additional spaces, which is good. And also, as with Trinity, we will start with the year 7, we'll open with the year 7 students and then obviously build that up each year up to full capacity over time. We're working with the Trust at the moment and the DfE to agree at the admissions process. So hopefully all of that will be in place, ready for that admissions window. There's obviously been a lot of temporary expansions of existing secondary schools, and as always, huge thanks to school leaders within secondary provisions that have been part of the solution over the last few years to meet that rising demand for places. So Ian's going to be discussing the future projections and the impact of the increased spaces with heads over the next couple of months, and that can obviously come back to Schools Forum when ready, either in the July one or September, whichever is most appropriate. So Sarah mentioned earlier the pressures on the primary, which have the opposite issue to secondary. So where we saw that bulge go through primary, we're now looking at a falling roll. There's no indication at the moment of any significant increase in birth rates, and obviously the housing developments don't necessarily correlate to additional families within that area, although that is part of the forward projections. But there has been a range of work happening to try and support schools to address the issues, and obviously it is an ongoing concern for some of our settings. So the range of work that we've been doing and colleagues have been doing with individual schools and clusters of schools, they've been working directly with schools and groups who have raised pupil numbers as a problem, so that have approached the local authority directly to raise concerns, supported them in consulting to manage down the public admissions number, or the PAN, where appropriate, and where they are maintained schools, we've worked with them to develop recovery plans to mitigate the impact over time. I've certainly talked before at Schools Forum about repurposing underutilised space, specifically thinking about that shortfall in specialist provision. So that's definitely been part of the conversations that we've been having about how to, as I say, repurpose the space to meet wider needs in the city. But I think there's certainly wider conversations that can be had, and that we've started to have with some of our schools about the use of community spaces, and particularly as we move forward to think more about that locality working and models of working such as the family hubs, which is obviously going to be become a reality for Bristol over the coming months, and certainly for the foreseeable. We've also got the integrated care system that's very much going to be about education, health and care, working together within localities and communities. So I think there's definitely a further conversation to have in terms of schools' role in providing space for that. Several schools in the city have reduced PAN for September 2023 in line with falling roles, and we've obviously reorganised schools with low pupil numbers, and you'll know that obviously St George and St Michael on the Mount was one of the most recent in order to improve sustainability. Academy schools are obviously in control of their admissions and PAN, so we're not in a position as a local authority to direct schools to reduce classes, but our approach has really been to work with schools across the area where there is concern, and work with them to identify where surplus spaces could be removed. We do have population data, as you know, and have been sharing this with our schools to support that forward planning. And there does need to be forward thinking on this, because it takes, to include the full consultation and preparation, it takes about 12 months in order to make any changes. So just moving on, just continuing with the sufficiency side of things, we've also received our capital allocations and had those confirmed for the next 2 years. So although this isn't specifically business of the Schools Forum, I know when Sarah and I were talking in the agenda planning meeting, we felt it would be useful as part of that wider conversation to share with you. So the basic need grant, that we have identified for 23-24, that's 14.599 million. So that's a good, healthy amount that will really help us with that whole expansion piece. It does drop down to 1.776 million in 24-25, but as you've heard at the start of this, that's as we've obviously will be delivering new places, so that should balance out for us. High needs provision. Now this again is another good news story in terms of those capital allocations. So we've receiving for 22-23 6.373 million, and then that moves up to 8.5 million next year. Now that's a significant increase to funding that we've had for SEN Capital previously, which has been around the 1.8 million. So again, really good timing in terms of that confirmation of funding. A paper is going to go to Cabinet in the summer, as always, a sort of re-baseline, and that will look at the capital priorities for the coming year. It'll work in that additional finance funding that we've now had confirmed, and that will all be added to the wider capital programme, and will outline the programmes moving forward in terms of where that spend is going to be. So that will be things like the in-year bulges, the size reduction, all of the priorities. And then the uplift in the SEN Capital is really timely as we move forward with that wave 2 of specialist provision programmes, as there's a number of new projects to deliver the 450 places by September 2024. And I think what's really important is that particularly with that specialist provision, it's an incredibly important part of our high needs block recovery plan, because that's about trying to reduce the amount of young people having to attend provision outside of Bristol due to the lack of local choice. So again, all of these different pieces kind of interconnect. And just as I mentioned, the high needs block recovery plan, we've we've just had further information literally last night in relation to the Send Best Value programme, which is the programme that sits beneath the safety valve and is going to be rolled out for 45 local authorities. So just in terms of very early information on this, obviously there'll be more information, and I'm pleased to hear the July meeting will go forward, because I think that's where we'll bring back further detail on the actual recovery plan, but also in terms of the best value as well. So the programme will be rolled out, as I say, in 3 waves. Bristol currently has been identified in wave 2, but we're obviously working with the DfE because we were hoping to be part of wave 1. So the first 20 authorities, that wave 1, will be commencing work in June this year. The second tranche, which we're part of, will be in the autumn term in 2022, so it's not too long to wait if we're not able to be part of wave 1. And then the third 15 authorities will be spring next year in 2023. So what we need to do is we need to continue to put our energies into delivering the high needs block recovery plan, and that is built on the mitigations that I brought to the meeting previously. We can now access as well some additional support from the ESFA, that local authority stakeholder engagement team that have been put in place for the best value, and they're offering to view and review and challenge the plans. So that's an offer we've not had available to us previously, and we'll certainly look to use that between now and the autumn. They'll also be holding a series of workshops to cover the management of high needs budgets and the use of the DSG management plans. So again, we're just waiting for further details on that, and we'll certainly be proactive and engaged in all the additional support prior to the actual programme itself commencing in the autumn term. So that's, Sarah's, probably the main points I wanted to make.
Great, thank you very much, Alison. Some really good progress in some of those areas. Any questions or any comments from Alison or anyone else? Simon?
Yeah, I don't know if this would fit with this bit or the next bit, but in terms of, it's come up as within the minutes, the pressure on early years, particularly maintain nursery schools, and how we move forward from this, which obviously also ties into integrated services, family hubs, etc., etc. So I just wondered, can we have a brief discussion maybe where we are on this, because from the point of view of nursery schools, there's only so much we can do financially in terms of combining, looking at different models, etc., which we've done an awful lot of, which I'm sure Richard would second me on. But we are also very mindful of the work that early years does in early intervention, early help, and where is this fitting in going forwards? Because the solution's does not just lie in nursery schools' hands, it's broader. And I can't see at the moment how that is being progressed within the new family hubs. And I know that sits outside possibly from what the Schools Forum does, but historically nursery schools always were supported financially for the family support they provide. I think the independent review, which has just been published on social care, recommends integrated place-based services, family hubs in schools where families go. So I think going forward, I mean, I think I'm myself and a lot of people are rather confused as to where the family hubs are actually sitting at the moment, and what they're actually doing and where they are and how people access them. So I think there's a lot of work to be done around that, and I think the voices from the nursery school and early years sector really need to be heard more in this.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah, do you want me to? Because I would imagine that some of the wider financial discussion will happen as part of the outturn report as well, and Richard obviously is joining tonight's discussion. But certainly, if I address the family hubs element, and then maybe we come back to the wider stuff. So at the moment, we are so we've been identified as part of 75 local authorities that will be receiving funding in order to roll out family hubs across the city. So at the moment, there isn't a family hub model, and there isn't family hubs in operation. We had previously done some work on the development of the family hubs, and certainly there've been a number of work streams which I know Lucy Driver, on behalf of the early years sector, has been actively part of, along with people like Nikki from the central team. So there's been some work in preparing what Bristol's response to family hubs would be in the development of family hubs, but there has been no funding up until this point. So at the moment, I mean, we're delighted to be part of the 75 local areas that are going to receive that funding. We don't know how much it is at the moment, so that we should hear that in the coming weeks, I'm hoping. But certainly what we know is that there's 301 million to be used for the Family Hub programme for the 3 years across those 75 authorities. So if I do my basic maths, I'm expecting Bristol's share of that to be, you know, circa 3 to 5 million, depending what criteria they're using. So where we are at the moment is there's been a series of engagement sessions with those 75 local authorities. So I've managed to attend quite a few of those, and that is looking at all the different elements from what's called the best start in life, or those, you know, critical 1001 days, of which the programme I think started about 18 months ago, the development of that programme, along with the actual family hubs model, and that will be everything from sort of pre-birth through to parenting. And certainly the work that we've done in Bristol is we want to see that expanded really through to sort of 19 and beyond, so that it becomes a resource for a community that you know, everybody has access to, and that it's a really integrated part of the actual community itself. Now, how the model of that is yet to be decided, but what we were, certainly with the pre-work that we were doing, what we weren't thinking about was a sort of hub as in a single building, but a network of provision and organisations working together out of a number of different spaces within that community. And I know, Simon, we've had conversations about, you know, what would be effective, certainly, you know, in Barton Hill, for example. So that's all sort of coming up in terms of what the programme actually looks like. Once we know the funding and the range of programmes itself, that's where we then start rolling this out, and we should get programme details in the summer. Later on in the summer. It hasn't come out yet, so our next term is anticipated that we'll receive more information. We have a citywide partnership steering group, and that's got representation from a range of different partners, including early years. So really making sure their voices are heard as part of this process. And that sits across education, health and care. So Richard, for example, is our lead for education, and we've got an equivalent in care and equivalent in health. So what we really need to make sure we do through this process is that it doesn't sort of unintentionally default to one particular area. It doesn't become too health focused or too care focused, but is very much a universal offer for our community. So I'm really happy, although it's not exclusively Schools Forum Business, actually it does kind of sit with a lot of the priorities. And certainly if we think about our pressures on our early years and our high needs block, actually, if we think about some of the resources that can sit at that community level, I'm really happy when we've got further details, Sarah, to bring back a presentation to the forum if people are interested.
I think that would be helpful. I think, what do you think, Simon? I think that'd be helpful to have that back.
Yeah, I think it would be very helpful to have that back, because at the moment I feel we're sort of stuck in a bit of a catch-22. And okay, you know, maintain nursery schools are setting their budgets now. 11 of 12 have got deficits. Whilst there's reductions, you know, savings that can be made, they've been really stretched as far as they can, because we can only operate within legal ratios as we are schools from the DFE, but not funded as schools. So we're in that catch-22. And the additional work that we do and have done always is somehow not fitting in it anywhere. So I think, you know, within this new integrated system, which I think is, you know, it's a fantastic idea, and that's what we really need in our communities. I think the solution somehow sits within that as well, but the solution isn't going to come this year for the budgets this year. So we've just got to kind of sit with this, I think, for a bit, and just keep progressing as much as we can. But the sooner we can have a kind of some kind of plan going forward, the easier it will be to bring down these deficits and make the thing sustainable. But as I say, like the solution does not just sit within nursery schools; it's a wider issue. So yeah, thanks. It would be helpful. Sure.
No, that's fine. I'll Sarah, I'll see what I can. I mean, I'm hoping that we'll get a sort of flurry of information coming out now that we've attended all of the initial briefing sessions and focus groups. So, but I think by July there should be a lot more information I can bring in terms of how much funding we've got, and the partnership steering groups taking place mid-June, so I can bring back obviously plans from that session as well.
Okay, that would be very helpful. Thank you, Alison. Sam, if you can note that as an action. But I think that's a two-part question, Simon, isn't it? And Alison's talked about potential new developments. Is there anything from a finance perspective, in light of what Simon's mentioned, facing deficits 11 out of 12, that we can share, looking at finance colleagues from the council?
I think, Sarah, shall we pick that up when we actually get the context after the outturn, and then hear from Richard, and then we can think about any next steps that we want to discuss as part of that, if that's okay?
Absolutely fine. Thank you, Denise. Okay, any other questions in relation to Alison's update for us? Okay, one from me, Alison. So specifically in relation to, we've talked about primary capacity for a couple of years now in relation to lower demand in relation to capacity that we've got. And I know that Ian Bell is going to be meeting with our secondaries around planning capacity for Temple Quarter School and the other Oasis School too. What assurances can the council provide secondary schools that we will not be in a similar position to our primaries? You know, what is being considered at the moment to make sure that our secondaries are also sustainable, and we don't need to have other conversations about reducing, you know, by 30, etc. in some of our secondaries to make those viable, in light of the fact that the Temple Quarter School was approved several years ago when there was indeed high demand, and now that demand is dropping away, as we've seen through our primaries.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and this is the piece of work that Ian is looking at the moment in terms of what the reality of those projections are going to be in terms of the new provision coming on, because we also have quite a high number of in-year movement and migration into the city as well. So we're just working through those. Obviously, there's also been various delays in housing programmes that have also kept numbers down within particular areas. So we just need to make sure that we have a really clear understanding of what we consider, you know, really intelligent projections in terms of all of those elements. And also within that create an element of choice as well that we don't have in the system in the way that we would want in Bristol. And you know, what would that threshold and kind of level of risk be in terms of having some local choice, but not too many capacity issues in the system that we see in primary. I think as well, there's also discussions that I'm having with Oasis in terms of, you know, and the DFE in terms of what was planned for with regard to forms of entry, what, as I say, those projections are telling us, and whether or not that is the plan going forward, as was, as you say, a number of years ago when the sort of blueprints were put together. There's then also that wider conversation about the specialist provision and whether or not look at incorporating specialist provision as part of new development. And then very keen to have wider conversation about community spaces. I do think that's something that we need to look at in more detail across Bristol, because I think that's a really efficient way of delivering resources, you know, within those spaces, and kind of thinking about schools in a slightly more extended way than maybe we do at the moment. And we've got some good examples of schools that work and reach out into the communities, that bring additional funding in, and you know, use some of their space in more innovative ways. So I'm keen to look at how we make sure it's almost a sort of a future design of our schools as much as anything else.
Very much. Okay, there aren't any other questions or comments for Alison, then I'll move us on to the DSG Budget Monitor item.
Sorry, Sarah, I got one question.
Sorry, Simon.
If I can. It was just regard to the sort of the secondary places, and obviously I think Ian made a comment at the previous meeting prior to the Oasis schools getting the go-ahead, that he fears that we could be in the position we're in with primary schools now in secondaries in 5 years' time. And then, Alison, you made a comment about obviously working with those maintained primaries that are kind of looking at their forms of entry. And you sort of made reference to obviously academies having to kind of do that challenge themselves. I guess obviously with secondaries, with only 1 or 2 schools within the city that aren't academies, I guess certainly speaking on behalf of the academy sector, we don't want to be sort of left if we don't have the information about student projections and what that's doing. Is there, it's just a plea really for Ian and his team to sort of keep sharing that information about projections. I mean, if it feels like, you know, as a city, you know, we're still growing, still people coming into the city, but we obviously don't want to be in that position. So I guess it's just a plea to pass back to Ian and his team, just to keep the dialogue open and keep information and forecasts with everyone, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that he's talking to a number of trusts over the coming weeks, but also taking the latest data to BASHP, which is the Secondary Heads Association, in probably later in June, I think. Just in terms of the reference to the academies, the only point I was making was that we can't direct academies. However, we've certainly been working with academies, primary academies, in terms of looking at the numbers, looking at, you know, what's happening in terms of housing within their community, and so absolutely make sure that we get the data out. Yeah, we're not working in a silo on this.
Thank you both. Okay, so then on to item 5, DSG Budget Monitor. Now, Angel, is this one you're taking us through?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. This paper is just going to give you a brief overview of where we landed in 21-22. Last time we reported a forecast position in March, sorry, that was as at P10 is October 2021 position. So that's where we benchmark our end of the year position to. So you are invited to note the 21-22 position, autumn position. The provisional position is £14.6 million deficit, which we will discuss by different blocks in a minute. And the cumulative deficit for DSG is now 24.6 million, including brought forward balance of £10 million. And we mentioned earlier on about the maintained schools end of year position, including 4 children's centres. The end of year position, provisional position, is around £4.2 million. Again, you know, we will discuss that and look into details in a minute. We also mentioned briefly that about the deficits in maintained schools. So 14 maintained schools had a deficit balance as well. So we will cover in this paper. So in terms of the £14.6 million and deficit position, it's a just over £2 million improvement in comparison to P10 forecasts. We did forecast £16.7 million deficit, in year deficit, but luckily we didn't utilize all the provisions we estimated. which we will cover in a minute, areas of improvements at the end of the year. The schools block, we've entered the year with 898,000 surplus, including the brought forward balance 619,000. So there is the £1.5 million surplus and will be carried forward to the future years. And the reason of this underspend is because of the 3 schools were closed at the end of August 2021, and the funding formula was based on the old settings. And although we opened 1 new school at Willow Park, so these movements accounts for about just under £500,000 underspent, and we had £2.4 million commitments in on growth fund, and against our actual funding, we allocated 2.8, so that's another over £400,000 underspent. So that makes up the schools block underspent of £898,000. So yeah. So the cumulative balance will be £1.5 million and carry forward to 22-23, including the brought forward balance of £619,000. The delegation, we didn't collect any funding for the year, but we've had a couple of invoices, and so we used the reserves to offset the spending of £49,000. So we started the year with £553,000, and now we ended the year with just over £500,000 because of the £49,000 we didn't have the budget for, which we will continue to carry that forward in a separate line and designated for dededicated items only. The school central block, we almost broke on budget, and there's £8,000 overspent because of the on the support costs. So that's almost on the spot. Early years, there is a £149,000 overspent. This in-year deficit has mainly because of the SEND pressure in early years, which Richard will join us and will give us some more insight on that as well. And I've also mentioned it in my report. I presume you've read it, and the trends in terms of reductions in numbers for 2-year-olds and 3 to 4-year-old, which obviously due to the lower participation. And the most challenging block, as you all know, is the high needs block, where we've recorded an in-year deficit of £15.3 million. And although the position is about £2.3 million better than the forecast in P10, and this is still significant. Hence, the transformation project will be going on to looking into the mitigations and how we turn the curve around. So the improvements in comparison to P10 forecast is mainly driven by the 600,000 we've done end of the year in data cleansing and a checking on what we have in the system. And there is £1 million underspent on the GFE contingency, which did not realize. We've checked with our SEND and team and double checked and triple checked. They said no, don't need that. And there is a slight underspend in pay costs and spot purchasing of 242 and 182,000. And so the main increase in the high needs block expenditure is driven by the 10% increase in EHCP plans, as well as the over 25% increase in live cases as well. And we have just approved the general fund budget to increase the capacity in the SEND support team and the psychologists to deal with the pressures. So going forward, there will be increase in the EHCP plan, and hopefully, the need will settle down at some point, with the interventions from the DSG management plan. So so this is the main in-year movements in each of the blocks, and given the deficit position and the balances in schools block, £1.5 million, and early years block, just over £500,000, is assumed to be used to offset the deficits. And there is the transformation project balance of 740,000, and the delegation 500,000, and will be again, used for what it's intended for. But the other balances, schools block and early years block, is assumed to be used to offset the DSG deficit balances. And the section 6 of the paper outline the individual schools balances by settings, nurseries, primary, secondary, special hub, and the children's centers. So the overall, the brought forward balance is reduced from 6.4 million to 4.2 million. So that's a movement of 2.1 million pound, and that movement's including the closed school balance of 300. So if you're looking at the schools still under the local authority domain, and from September 2022 will be about 1.8 million pound. So 6.2 is just outlining the starting position, where we've had a 15 out of 63 maintained schools with the revenue deficit. By the end of the year, we've ended with 14 schools shared a deficit position of 2.1. As Simon mentioned earlier on, there are 14 schools with a deficit position, 11 of which majority of them are nursery schools. And so the nursery schools in year movement is about 1.2 million. Yeah. And so that's the majority of the deficits. Yeah, and early years team led by Richard, and will give us an update in terms of interventions they're proposing. So taking into the consideration of the DSG deficit we've just briefly shared with you. So the total expenditure in 21-22 was 83.78 million pound, excluding the high needs funding directly passported to schools. And the budget for 22-23, excluding the passported element of schools, is about 78 million. So before we start the year, and there is a £5.5 million gap already, assuming everything stays as is. But given the trend in terms of EHCP plans increase and the number of cases increasing, so our starting point for 22-23 is £5.6 million gap already. And all the details by blocks is available in Appendix 1. I presume you've had a chance to look at that. And I don't know if you've got any questions for me.
Okay, thanks very much, Angel.
Thank you.
Through the paper, I think there's a few questions that will come up, but Denise, I think you may want to clarify a couple of things.
I did. I just wanted to clarify one point, and that is in relation to the carry forward position. So Angel is correct that obviously we've got the net position in terms of the DSG. In relation to the schools block, the DfE have confirmed the position in terms of those potential underspends and what can and cannot be utilised by the local authority, and that's probably been summarised in the report. However, in terms of the early years block, it wasn't our intent that the early years carry forward would be utilised for the high needs. I think there were some discussions to be had about the early years programme and any sort of potential funding or support to meet some of the challenges that's already been discussed by Simon and possibly going to be discussed by Richard. So I think it's just giving some clarification in terms of 5.2 to ensure that it's clear that it wasn't intent that the early years would be, early years carry forward would be offsetting the wider DSG deficits generated by the high needs block. So I think it was clarifying that point before we hand over for questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Denise, because that was going to be one of my questions, because I thought historically we couldn't use any underspends in other blocks to support effectively a deficit in the high needs block, but we are saying now that the DfE would allow that with consultation with Schools Forum.
No, I think in terms of, and I will hand over to Travis to give us the exact wording on which aspect of the schools block, but I think where schools have changed or closed during the year, then that is at the local authority discretion how that is utilised, and we would propose that it's utilised to support the wider DSG deficit. In terms of the early years block, that's really a matter for Forum to discuss how we utilise the early years block, but there might be some propositions in terms of meeting some of the challenges being discussed earlier, of which Richard will come back to. But Travis, can you just clarify the position in terms of the schools block and which area can and cannot be utilised?
Yeah, so yes, essentially you're correct. So the ESFA awards the DSG as a whole, and it's for that particular year's activity, that particular year's funding. And schools block formula is driven by the current cohort of pupils, and that funding award to each individual school is to support that year's worth of activity. Now, when we've had school closures, we've clarified with the ESFA that what we do with that effectively the underspend, because that school's no longer continuing, that's ceased during the year, it's not spent all of its allocation. And the advice we've been given is that that underspend is now not part of that current financial year, and so it forms part of the overall DSG balance. The DSG is one grant, but it's in 4 blocks. So it forms part of that basis, and the recommendation is that given that our overall grant is in deficit, then we haven't got spare money in scale schools block because there isn't spare money in the DSG. So it would be part of the bottom balance, although for accounting purposes, we do identify it separately. Early years, you're quite right, the convention is that we've seen when participation rises, the spend on early years participation rises, but our funding is on 1 percentage point, but we give it out on 3. So we prefer, or we don't, bring the early years balance into the overall bottom balance, because we know there's, as I think Graham presented to Forum a couple of years ago, it goes up and it goes down. So we try to manage it within the block itself there.
Thank you, Travis. That's a helpful summary. So I understand the where there's been misalignments in funding due to school closures, but the growth fund, tiny amount in the whole scheme of things, but is that also able to be utilised to support the DSG? Because, you know, historically we've had to consult with the Secretary of State if we want to move money between blocks.
Growth fund's part of
stance.
Yeah, growth fund is part of schools block, so it forms part of the schools block balance. So that prevailing advice applies.
Okay, so any underspend in the school block in its entirety can be used towards the DSG. Okay. Okay, Simon.
I had 2 questions, if I can. First one, just about the obviously the size of the deficit and when the safety valve might kick in, because I've noted that South Gloucestershire, that are part of that safety valve programme, I think their deficit is around about 32 million pounds, and they've got, you know, they're trapped by this safety valve system. And I mean, I don't know the details of it, but I imagine the intervention from the DfE would be pretty catastrophic to SEM funding. Don't know, but just wondering what your thoughts are what size of deficit we might have before that might kick in. And the second question is just what's the overall kind of Bristol City Council cabinet view on the size of the deficit, and you know how that falls in relation to the overall deficit within the council, and whether there is any extra pressure to kind of move on the transformation programme.
Yeah, I can certainly answer the first part of your question in relation to the safety valve. We don't know the exact formula because it's not just about the size, but it is about also the extended pressure on the wider council budget. And we certainly know that those local authorities that are part of the safety valve and also those in the tranche 1 above us, there doesn't seem to be at the moment any clear indication as to why people are falling into different pots in terms of the size of their deficit. It's also the percentage of that deficit in relation to the size of their high needs block that will be part of it. And also, as I say, certainly when we attended the launch meeting on this, the DfE were also talking about the sort of the wider pressures on the council as well that they're taking into consideration. So I don't think there's a line at the moment, or certainly that's not being made clear to us, that if we hit that, then we automatically go into the safety valve. What they have said is that at a point through the best value programme, we could move across to the safety valve if that was considered in the best interest by everybody that's involved in the programme. But at the moment, they're very much focused on it being part of the Send Best Value programme. And as I say, we're at the moment we're certainly sitting in tranche 2. I don't know, Denise, if you wanted to add anything in terms of
yes, I'll come in just in terms of providing that clarity. So as you're probably aware, and Alison may have updated you previously, we did make representation to express an interest in being part of the safety valve discussion, and unfortunately we weren't successful in that, but we have been successful in being part of the Delivering Better Value in SEND programme. They are 2 different programmes. The Delivering Better Value in SEND is a 3-year programme, and in reality it tries to focus on achieving sustainability, but does not tackle the historic legacy deficits, which we probably estimate will be somewhere close to £40 million. By the end of the next financial year. Now, as Alison had outlined earlier, we start that programme in the autumn, but again, it won't tackle the deficit. So in terms of the statutory override, which you'd mentioned earlier, the statutory override is currently expected to end at March 23, so at the end of this financial year. And following the discussions we've had with both DLUC and also the DfE that Alison and colleagues may have had, and also the narrative that we've had, there is still no current proposal put forward by either of the parties to extend the override. So at this stage, we still have to assume that that override will end, and that we will need to reach some arrangements or agreement with our auditors in terms of the next steps. We're hoping at that stage that we are firmly embedded in the programme, the DBV programme, and making good progress, and be able to demonstrate to our auditors that we are making good progress on the education transformation programme, and that we have a clear mitigation plan, albeit a long-term plan, to turn that curve. We will still obviously continue to make representation and ask for the override, because we think that that is the appropriate thing to do. But we recognise that DLUC have said repeatedly that they don't believe that this is the correct accounting treatment etc. of these deficits. I think you'd also mentioned or asked for the view of Cabinet. I think I'd say that Cabinet share our concerns and would say to you that they are concerned. It remains, one of the biggest challenges and potential future risk in terms of long-term sustainability. And also I've been, obviously reviewing our progress, our education transformation programme. So I'd say that it is collective ownership of the challenges that we face and working collaboratively with us and Alison and the team to try and reach to some solutions to be able to move forward. So I think that would probably hopefully answer the questions. May have been a long-winded way, but hopefully I've been clear enough on the different components, Simon.
Thanks, Denise. Simon, I think that covers your questions. Yeah, all good. Thank you, Denise. And absolutely, we're here to support to help to bring that deficit down. Simon.
Yeah, I think you sort of kind of answered the question really, because I was slightly I'm not familiar with the terminology, like what is the safety valve, and because it didn't sound very safe, and and I mean basically what we're saying is that by 2023 we need a plan going forward, which is going to be a collaborative between everybody within the wider council to look at how these services develop, which comes back to this place-based integrated services, family homes and all. So there's a lot of work to be done over the next year to get that in place. So that's what I'm understanding from what you're saying. But we seem to have made a good start with all of that, and hopefully, we're on the right trajectory.
Simon, is there anything specifically we wanted to pick up then around early years when we're carrying forward, we're proposing to ring fence that underspend, sorry, to support future initiatives? Is that something that we need to talk about now?
Yeah, I wonder whether it would be quite useful for Richard to come in at this point, because obviously he and the team have been leading the work with our head teachers of our maintained nurseries and governing bodies, just to talk through some of the actions that have happened so far, the impact of that, and then obviously next steps. So if I can hand over to you, Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Yeah, and I think the small underspend, if it may be that after this discussion, it might be that we come back with a potential sort of ask for the use of some of that money to Forum to support us with the work, to add to some of our capacity in that area. That would be great. So we've been the nursery school deficits are a particular risk for us, and the deficits have been growing. So the deficit at the moment is standing at 5.2 million. So about 1.2 million movement during the last financial year. So it's significant. We've been working with the nursery school head teachers and governors for a period of time now. All through COVID, we've been working on some of the challenges there. So what we've done is we've worked with the nursery schools to really understand the challenges and the pressures that the schools are under, what are causing some of the financial pressures for them. And we've done that with individual schools and then brought those together into some strategic proposals in terms of how we look at the nursery schools and look to manage their review of how they operate. So those areas have been shared with the head teachers and governors. They include looking at areas such as where there are, on a very basic level, where there are non-class based roles, whether those are necessary, how those can be looked at, whether there are ways in which schools can share resources and staffing across schools to reduce costs. We're also looking at the SEND funding and 2-year-old funding aspects of the nursery school budgets, because those do put particular pressure on them. Nursery schools take a significant number of children with SEND in the early years, and they also are one of our biggest providers of 2-year-old provision, which is notoriously underfunded. So those are some key financial pressures that we're working on with them as well. We're also looking at other areas such as co-location, which links with Simon's sort of points earlier around integrated offer and the family hubs. There's a synergy there between what we want to offer through family hubs and looking to utilize spare space, etc., in the nursery buildings where we have it, and also looking at family support and how the family support offer that comes through the nursery schools can be supported, because again, nursery schools providing their own family support, as well as family support that's provided through the children's centres. So we need to look at how that works strategically as well for both nurseries and the local authority. The nursery schools have been facing other pressures, like all schools. There's the increasing costs with flat funding. Nursery schools also, over the last 2 years, have had to absorb all costs associated with COVID, because they didn't receive any funding like schools did to support them through COVID. So there were some costs there. And like I said, SEND and 2-year-old provision are cost pressures for them. So what we've been doing is we've been working to pull together a set of terms of reference around how we're working with the nursery schools that outline that. Our strategic proposals are underlining the conversations we're having now. We're looking very much more now at how schools come together more collaboratively. So that might be around sharing staff, but also in more sort of hard collaborations, potentially through federation. So schools are now looking at how they group together to share governance, leadership, etc. So those are the next steps. And what we're looking to do is to turn our discussions into very clear plans that we can then demonstrate how those plans are going to be delivered, and obviously the savings, but really what we're talking about is sustaining and safeguarding our early years education at the same time as making these savings. But these savings really do need to be made. So that's where we're at the moment. So the next piece of work is to get those plans drawn up. But what Denise alluded to around using some of the carry forward would be helpful in that capacity to support the nursery schools in some of this work would be very welcome. So that's where we are, but I'm happy to take any questions or clarify any points if people need it.
Thank you, Richard. That's very helpful. The £5 million deficit that you mentioned, in terms of context, what is that as a percentage of total income that the nurseries get? So just we get sort of an idea of how big that deficit is. That might be a question for finance colleagues.
We might have to.
Yeah, I would look to Travis. You may be able to work through it very quickly whilst you maybe just continue on with the conversation and then come back with a figure at the end. So Travis, if you can just have a look on your table and just calculate that, that would be helpful.
Lovely, thank you, Denise. Simon, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, please. I mean, there's a lot involved in all this, and we've had very helpful discussions with Richard and Nicola, and we have been, as you said, working over it over the last 2 years, all the way through COVID, where often we were the only service that was actually open to parents in our localities and offering family support all through that. So I think one of the big issues for us in nursery schools is around family support and the role we've always had. And historically, nursery schools were funded for the family support they provided. When this funding was removed, schools started going into deficit. There's been a movement from nursery school funding into other areas of the council, which have led to a deficit in nursery schools. And I mean, that is, as far as I can see, that needs to be addressed, because at the moment, we're still continuing to provide the service we always have, but we can't quite see where that service that the funding has gone to is delivering. And I think that's a big problem in Bristol that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed over the next year, as Alison was saying, through looking at these family hubs models, because we don't know where they sit yet. But the work's still carrying on. The families still need supporting. Children still need help. Families still need help. We often provide that. So I think that is a really big issue. The other issue is around, Alison, Rich raised around 2-year-old funding. the best way to tackle deprivation in the early years in Bristol is to support 2-year-old funding, the 2-year-old provision. By definition, they're the most needy families in Bristol. The funding is nationally recognised, it's underfunded. I think the local authority does have the power to supplement that funding. Supplementing that funding would directly address deprivation in Bristol, and it would go to the most needy families, and I think that is actually family support too. The other issue around that is that low uptake in the highest areas of deprivation of the 2-year-old funding, of the 2-year-old places. So only 50% of the children are actually taking it up. I think there's a big piece of work to do around that, because if more children were taking up those offers, there would be more money.
So just to come back in on the 2-year-old offer, there has been quite a significant amount of work on 2-year-old take up. It's now at 70%, so it's much higher than it was. And as you know, COVID impacted on take up across the sector as well. So, but I do take your point that we need as many 2-year-olds to take up their eligible 2-year-olds to take up their offer as possible. Not only for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the settings that are providing the service as well.
Yeah, I don't dispute that, but if you look at certain areas of the city, the uptake of 2-year-old provision is lower than in other areas of the city, and the areas of the city where it's the lowest are the 2 areas of the highest deprivation.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I think we are starting to understand how challenging it has been, especially given the considerable deficits and take up of pupils. So we'll make sure that we support where we can in terms of taking that agenda forward. So I'll make sure it's on the July meeting. So if we can commit to providing an update on what that next steps in terms of early years support, having that paper around what we'd spend that money on or other strategies, that would be very helpful. Denise?
Is it worthwhile confirming whether Forum support that approach in principle? So do you endorse that approach in terms of coming back with a paper and utilising some of that funding as part of the programme and to provide the capacity and the resource to drive this forward?
Okay, so I think for general steer for me would be that it's important that that surplus is ring-fenced, protected to the early years to support their future viability. So I think that I would welcome a paper coming back to be considered, especially in light of what Simon and Richard have both talked about. But are there any objections to that approach? No, so I think there's support for that, please, Denise, and
yeah.
consider it.
Thank you, we'll work on that. And just for Travis, if you haven't got it, Travis, it's fine, we can come back to it. But if you do have that percentage, it would be useful to share.
I think, yeah, I've preferred to give a written response after they circulate it to the group afterwards. That's all right.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, that's fine, thank you. It was just to get it into a bit of context, really.
Yeah.
Because it could be a small percentage or quite a large one. And in terms of the other balances, the deficit balances for schools, where does that sit? Does that sit outside of the DSG in terms of balance the council?
It does. It sits in a separate reserve in terms of the schools reserve, and then it's net of some of the other reserves that are held overall. Then there's a small surplus when we net off all of the reserves for schools. I don't have the figure at hand, but it will be in our accounts when we publish it.
Thank you, Denise. It was just clarifying that point and how much at risk that was, because at the moment it's a surplus, but obviously with challenges perhaps coming through, that might be at risk as well, but hopefully not. Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions on the paper or any other decision making that we need to do? Because I think these are all just for information. Anything else? I think what in terms of the interesting points to know would be the where we mentioned that there was 15 provisions that started the year in deficit, and then there was 14 at the end of the year. If they were the same ones, or if actually they've changed, or if they were the nurseries, etc. So perhaps a little bit more understanding around that for the next meeting would be helpful, please.
Travis, you probably have that information at hand. I'm just trying to avoid us having to come back if you have got the information.
Sorry, you caught me writing something down there.
Sorry, the 15 schools that started the deficit, started the year with the deficit, and the 14 that ended, were they one and the same? I think they were, but if you can clarify the position, that would be helpful.
The 15, so yeah, we had the 11 nursery schools and 4 primary schools, and we've the position improved when primary school's not in deficit anymore, but yeah, it's not any ones in surplus going into more deficit.
Okay, that's helpful to know, and that's what I was basically getting at. So thank you, that's helpful. Okay, I think that's it then in terms of the main agenda items, the papers that we've got available. So as I mentioned, I do think it's important that we do continue with the July meeting, although historically we've not always tended to have that one. But I think we've got 3 items that we'll be bringing back to the next meeting anyway. Are there any other items of any other business? No, okay. I've just got one, and that's in relation to Ukraine refugees and what financial packages are available to support pupils that are located into Bristol schools.
Yeah, so we do receive funding that then gets passported out to schools. I think it's the same funding arrangements as we had for the Afghanistan children that arrive. So it's I think it's 4,500 per child, and also a pool of funding to support special educational needs if required as well, that schools can apply for on an individual basis. So I'm pretty sure that's working quite well in terms of as soon as that child starts, that funding is then following that child into that individual placement. And of course, with the Ukrainian scheme particularly, what we're seeing is a lot of children attend a number of different schools across the city, whereas for the Afghanistan bridging hotels, it was quite consolidated around the east central and central area. So it should be more manageable for schools, I think, this particular programme.
Great, thanks very much, Alison. I've had a number of questions on that one, so just wanted to clarify the position. Thank you. Okay, so that takes us then to the end of the meeting, and it will be our July one, which will be our last one for the year, and also Alison's last meeting as well. We'll very much be missed, Alison, but look forward to your update at the last meeting in July. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy your evening, and I'll see you soon.